Well, greetings. I hope you're doing very, very well today and that God is continuing to bless you in the midst of the craziness of our world. Now, this is James Fuller, and today we're talking about the prophet Ezekiel. Specifically, we're going to be looking at the very first chapter, which is a vision. Now, Ezekiel was a prophet and a priest. He prophesied from about 593 to 571 BC. This was toward the end of the Judean kingdom. Ezekiel was taken captive with other Jews in 597 BC, which means that during his ministry, he lived and ministered in Babylon. To help us understand the times in which Ezekiel lived, I think it's best to consider the dark state of the kings and the nation during that time. Now, after King Josiah, who was a really good and reforming king, after he tragically dies, Jehoahaz at the age of 23 is crowned king. Now, this did not last long, for King Necho of Egypt deposed Jehoahaz and imposed a heavy tribute on Judah. Now, with the removal of Jehoahaz, we can see the judgment of God coming upon Judah very quickly. In fact, from this moment, Judah would no more be independent. Other nations would dominate Judah and appoint its vassal leadership. The destruction, devastation, and exile was coming as God's judgment for Judah's gross rebellion and sin. Now, King Necho chose another son of Josiah, Eliakim, to replace Jehoahaz. He changed his name to Jehoiakim. Now, the Bible tells us that Jehoiakim did evil, nothing but evil, in God's sight for his 11-year reign. We must not take this lightly. Do not take lightly the evil of the last kings of Judah. In fact, in Jeremiah 22, it tells us about how evil and wicked the sons of Josiah were. Jeremiah laments about Jehoiakim and his son Jehoiachin. Now, Jehoiakim, what he did is he built a palace for himself while the people suffered. And he forced the people to work without compensation. Now, this is Jeremiah chapter 22, starting in verse 13. This is what the prophet says. Woe to him who builds his house by unrighteousness and his upper rooms by injustice, who makes his neighbor serve him for nothing and does not give him his wages, who says, I will build myself a great house with spacious upper rooms, who cuts out windows for it, paneling it with cedar and painting it with vermilion. Do you think you are a king because you compete in cedar? This is what the prophet of God is saying. Did not your father eat and drink and do justice and righteousness? Then it was well with him. He judged the cause of the poor and needy, then it was well. Is not this to know me, declares the Lord? But you have eyes and heart only for your dishonest gain, for shedding of innocent blood, for practicing oppression and violence. That's all the way through verse 17. Now, at the beginning of Jehoiakim's reign, Judah was under Egyptian rule. However, in 605 BC, the Egyptians were defeated by Babylon. While initially this meant that Judah would be free from Egyptian domination, we all know another power much more fierce was coming. King Nebuchadnezzar attacked Judah 3 times in 605, 597, and 586. And we have already stated that Ezekiel was taken captive and went to Babylon in the second attack in 597. King Nebuchadnezzar is a very important king in history and in the Bible. We know he conquered Jerusalem and looted the temple. He took the vessels from the Jewish temple and placed them in his own Babylonian temple. And according to Daniel chapter 1, this was in the 3rd year of Jehoiakim's reign. Now Nebuchadnezzar took Jehoiakim prisoner and bound him in chains. But Nebuchadnezzar ended up restoring Jehoiakim to the Judean throne as a vassal. Jehoiakim is also the same king who cut up in pieces the prophecies of the prophet Jeremiah and threw it into a fire. That's found in Jeremiah 36. And he's also the same king who killed Uriah, who prophesied in the name of the Lord. That's found in Jeremiah 26. And this tells you something about this king. In the end, Jehoiakim met a violent death in much the same manner as Uriah, whom the king had murdered. Now, in 597, following the death of Jehoiakim, his son Jehoiachin took the throne. However, his reign was very short. It was only about 3 months. Nebuchadnezzar again attacked Jerusalem, but the city was defenseless, and Jehoiachin surrendered. Jeremiah prophesied about these events in Jeremiah 22. Now, in 2 Kings 24, the text tells us Nebuchadnezzar carried 10,000 captives to Babylon. This included the king Jehoiachin, and also, as we've already stated, it included who? Ezekiel. Now, Nebuchadnezzar placed the only surviving son of Josiah, Mathaniah, on the Judean throne. But he changed his name to Zedekiah. This was done to show Judah's subjection to Babylon. Zedekiah was the last of the Judean kings. He reigned for 11 years and was like so many other kings before him. Unfortunately, he refused to obey God and practiced evil. Most of us remember him due to his interactions with the prophet Jeremiah. Repeatedly, Jeremiah warned the king to submit to Babylon, but of course Zedekiah rebelled, and this brought about another invasion from Babylon. This was the final attack and ended any and all rebellion. Zedekiah fled when the attack came, but he was captured. Nebuchadnezzar had Zedekiah's sons killed in front of him, and they took him to Babylon in chains, where he died. Now, you might be wondering why I have bothered to give this dark history of Judah's last years. Well, the context is necessary to understand the times of Ezekiel. After King Josiah, Judah plummeted into darkness with evil, vile, and rebellious kings. And we can understand that today. And this time was ended by God with the exile of the Jews into Babylon. This historical background helps us understand the times of Ezekiel and his call from God. The collapse of the nation was imminent, and so we understand the dramatic and harsh announcements of God's coming judgments, which we find in Ezekiel. Now, many of the prophets in the Bible had very dramatic calls. But Ezekiel, his commissioning vision is one of the most elaborate, dramatic, and complicated. Now, on July 31st, 593 BC, Ezekiel tells us the heavens were opened and he saw visions of God, or probably more accurately, a divine vision. We should not take this lightly. Ezekiel looked into the heavens and observed the reality of God in all his glory in a way that is not normally accessible. The strength and wonder of the vision was likely to secure the resolve the prophet would need to accomplish his prophetic task. Now, before we dive into one of the most profound visions found in the Bible, let us stop for just a moment and consider the purpose of the book. Ezekiel was a son of a priest of the Zadok family, but there is no evidence he ever performed priestly functions in Jerusalem. He was exiled to Babylon, where he prophesied for about 20 years. Now, the book of Ezekiel has 3 major divisions. Chapters 1 through 24, where the prophet declares the coming judgment of Jerusalem for their rebellion against God's covenant. Then you have chapters 25 through 32, which announces judgment on foreign nations. But the last chapters, the last division, is chapters 33 through 48. That declares the restoration and blessing of the future kingdom of Jesus Christ. That last part is so critically important, right? restoration. One of the main purposes of the book is to correct wrong thinking, to help God's people understand they are not innocent and that God is righteous in his indignation. His judgment is righteous. That's one of the things that Ezekiel is communicating to them. Now, in Ezekiel 18:25, the people say, "The way of the Lord is not just." But Ezekiel corrects them with the words of God. And he says, Is it not your ways that are not just? And we can learn from this correction in thinking today as well, as God has the same message of correction for our nation. But in the book of Ezekiel, after the initial message of judgment, God speaks of his restoration and the coming messianic kingdom of peace. And as with many of the prophets of God, there is a dual message. Now, back to Ezekiel's inaugural vision. According to Daniel I. Block, the basic structure of Ezekiel's vision from chapter 1 is laid out this way. Starting in verse 4, you have an introduction. Then in verses 5 through 14, you have the 4 living creatures, which we'll talk about. Then the third part is the wheels in verses 15 to 21. Fourth, you have the platform and the throne. Very important. That's verses 22 to 27. And then finally, the fifth part is the conclusion, which wraps it up in verse 28. So now let's start in verse 4. The text states, "As I looked, behold, a storm wind came out of the north, and a great cloud with brightness around it, and fire flashing continually. And in the midst of the fire, as it were gleaming metal." Basically, Ezekiel looks up into the heavens and sees a brilliant storm cloud. Now, storm clouds and fire are used in the Old Testament to represent a storm theophany. So what exactly does that mean? Well, it means Yahweh is coming. Now, this can mean God is coming to fight for his people, but in this case, it seems to convey that God is coming in judgment to his covenant people. Nahum 1:3 says this, "The Lord is slow to anger and great in power, and the Lord will by no means clear the guilty. His way is in the whirlwind and storm, in the clouds or the dust of his feet." This is Psalm 50, verse 3 and 4. Our God comes. He does not keep silence. Before him is a devouring fire. Around him a mighty tempest. He calls to the heavens above and to the earth, that he may judge his people. So, God has opened up the heavens to show his prophet his glory and the reality of who he is. In this case, it is a storm theophany. The phrase "out of the north" could have a dual meaning, but it seems evident this simply means the heavens. You could reference Job 26:7 or 37:22 for similar language. Now let's move to verses 5 through 14, where it talks about the 4 living creatures. Now I want to be as clear as possible as we make our way through this chapter. It is difficult. The language is ancient and cryptic. But I would submit to you this group of verses is very, very important. How do I know? Because number one, it is in your Bible, right? But also the 4 living creatures are mentioned other places in the Bible. The 4 creatures are mentioned in Ezekiel chapter 1 and 10, but also extensively in Revelation. They're mentioned in Revelation chapter 4, chapter 5, chapter 6, 14:3, 15:7, and 19:4. Okay? Mentioned multiple times. Now in Ezekiel chapter 10, the prophet gives an explanation where he tells us that the living creatures are actually what? They're cherubim. If you're not familiar with the different classes of heavenly hosts, cherubim are considered in the higher hierarchy of angels because they serve God directly around his throne. Now let's read what Ezekiel saw. Okay, starting in verse 5. "And from the midst of it came the likeness of 4 living creatures, and this was their appearance. They had a human likeness, but each had 4 faces, and each of them had 4 wings. Their legs were straight, and the soles of their feet were like the soles of a calf's foot. And they sparkled like burnished bronze. Under their wings, on their four sides, they had human hands. And the four had their faces and their wings thus. Their wings touched one another. Each one of them went straight forward without turning as they went. And for the likeness of their faces, each had a human face. And the four had the face of a lion on the right side, and the four had the face of an ox on the left side, and the four had the face of an eagle. Such were their faces, and their wings were spread above. Each creature had 2 wings, each of which touched the wing of another, while 2 covered their bodies, and each went straight forward. Wherever the Spirit would go, they went, without turning as they went. As for the likeness of the living creatures, their appearance was like burning coals of fire, like the appearance of torches moving to and fro among the living creatures. And the fire was bright, and out of the fire went forth lightning, and the living creatures darted to and fro like the appearance of a flash of lightning. And that's all the way through verse 14. Now let's try to step through this. First of all, I think it's best to give an overall picture of what Ezekiel is seeing. Now, Leslie Allen describes it this way: 4-winged humanoid figures, that's the cherubim, support on their heads a platform that represents the sky, above which sits the enthroned figure of Yahweh. Now, it should be noted that what Ezekiel is describing is similar to what is found throughout ancient Near Eastern royal and religious iconography or art. We might think of sky bearers from mythology or ancient art, but of course what Ezekiel saw is in fact real. But we must also keep in mind that he is seeing a vision, which means there will likely be extensive symbolism. Now, the number 4 is used quite a bit in the text. There are 4 angels who each have 4 faces and 4 wings. This number 4, typically means completeness or universality. In verse 10, it describes the 4 faces. It seems that each angel has a human face on the front, the face of a lion on the right, the ox on the left, and the face of an eagle at the back. While all of this seems foreign to us, it would have been very common in Ezekiel's time for both Babylonians and Israelites. In fact, the faces certainly have symbolic meanings. First of all 4 creatures are messianic symbols. Let me say that again. All 4 faces have messianic meanings. They're messianic symbols. The lion, of course, is a king and represents royalty. Genesis 49, 9 through 10 tells us, Judah is a lion's cub. From the prey, my son, you have gone up. He stooped down, he crouched as a lion and as a lioness. Who dares rouse him? The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor the ruler's staff from between his feet until tribute comes to him. And in Revelation 5:5, referring to Jesus Christ, it states, Weep no more, behold, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, the Root of David, has conquered, so that he can open the scroll and its 7 seals. Clearly, the symbol of a lion represents authority, power, kingship, and messianic royalty. Now, the eagle is known in the Bible for its swiftness and as a stately bird. In fact, eagles are the king of birds. They kill snakes, which is messianic. And they symbolize divine protection, deliverance, and mercy. And we know from Ezekiel chapter 17, eagles are associated with royalty. Now, the ox symbolizes agricultural fertility and divinity. The ox is the king of domestic animals. This animal also symbolizes leadership, a savior or deliverer, and God's wrath or judgment. Again, messianic symbolism. And lastly, the human face. Humans are, of course, considered kings of the earth, the highest created being outside of angels, and created in the image of God. But of course, Jesus Christ became a man, and a human face in the heavenly realm certainly represents Christ's humanity. Daniel Block notes, these images expressed in transcendent divine attributes of omnipotence and omniscience. So it's speaking about God, even in the cherubim. It's still speaking about God and his attributes. Now, carrying the divine throne, the four-headed cherubim declare that Yahweh has the strength and majesty of the lion, the swiftness and mobility of the eagle, the procreative power of the bull, and the wisdom and reason of humankind. Now, after all that, believe it or not, there is even more. You must remember that God opened up the heavens, and what Ezekiel is seeing is in fact real. The four creatures have another meaning as well. What is being described are the four cardinal points in the heavens. Remember, God has opened up the heavens. He's looking into heaven, right? Just like a compass that has a north, south, east, or west, we have the four cardinal points in the heavens. And when we look up into the heavens, what do we see? We see the stars, right? And this is known as the zodiac or Mazzaroth, i.e. the constellations. Now, there are 12 major signs of the zodiac. What Ezekiel is seeing is the four cardinal signs. Now, David Chilton, in his book on Revelation, states it this way. The faces of the cherubim in both Ezekiel and Revelation are the middle signs in the four quarters of the zodiac. The lion is Leo, the bull is Taurus, the man is Aquarius the waterer, and the eagle, as we have seen, is Scorpio. Chilton goes on to say that the Apostle John lists the creatures in counterclockwise order, probably because he is seeing them from heaven above rather than from the earth like Ezekiel. The correlation does not end there. In Numbers chapter 2, the 12 tribes of Israel correspond to the constellations. Like the angels in the heavens, there are four cardinal tribes: Judah the lion, Reuben the man, Ephraim the bull, and Dan the eagle. But we must remember that the earthly tabernacle was a replica of God's heavenly tabernacle. We should remember that God created the heavens and the stars, right? Genesis 1:14-18. And the birth of the Lord Jesus himself was announced to the Magi by the stars, Matthew 2:2. So what I am saying is that while the vision of Ezekiel is steeped in symbolism, it is also literal. Ezekiel is also describing the mechanics of the solar system. For example, in verses 13 and 14, the text tells us that the living creatures were like burning coals of fire, like torches and flashes of lightning. While certainly the prophet is using metaphor and symbolic language, the text also seems like a good description of what? Of the stars in the heavens. Now, let's move on to verses 15 to 21, which talks about the wheels. This is what it says. Now, as I looked at the living creatures, I saw a wheel on the earth beside the living creatures, one for each of the four of them. And as for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleam of beryl, and the four had the same likeness, their appearance and construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. And some translations say a wheel in the middle of a wheel. Now, when they went in any of the four directions without turning as they went. And the rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all four were full of eyes all around. And when the living creatures went, the wheels went beside them. And when the living creatures rose from the earth, the wheels rose. Wherever the Spirit wanted to go, they went, and the wheels rose along with them. For the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. When those went, these went, and when those stood, these stood. And when those rose from the earth, the wheels rose along with them, for the spirit of the living creatures was in the wheels. And that takes us all the way to verse 21. Now, interestingly enough, the book of Daniel also describes God's throne having wheels. In Daniel chapter 7, when the prophet describes a vision of the Ancient of Days. In addition, the vision of John in Revelation 4, which is very similar to Ezekiel 1 and 10, shows the appearance of eyes. This, of course, is also mentioned in Ezekiel. The eyes represent God's knowledge or omniscience, which we already mentioned. But they also represent stars and angels. And you can reference Revelation 1:20, where it specifically tells us that the stars are angels. However, in verse 15, the text tells us the wheels are on the earth. Ezekiel is seeing a throne chariot with 4 wheels. Now, before we get too far with this, I want to mention something quite important. In 1 Chronicles chapter 28, when King David is instructing Solomon on building the temple, there were very specific instructions. And in verse 18, it tells us, "For the altar of incense made of refined gold and its weight, also his plan for the golden chariot of the cherubim that spread their wings and covered the ark of the covenant of the Lord." In Exodus 25, when it describes the Ark of the Covenant and mercy seat, it also talks about 2 cherubim of gold. And I would submit to you what Ezekiel was seeing in the heavens is the original tabernacle of God in his throne. The tabernacle and ark described in the Old Testament is a replica of the heavenly dwelling of God. It's very important to understand that. Now back to Ezekiel in chapter 1, this is verse 16 and 17. This is what it says, "As for the appearance of the wheels and their construction, their appearance was like the gleaming of beryl, and the 4 had the same likeness, their appearance and their construction being as it were a wheel within a wheel. When they went in any of their 4 directions without turning as they went." Now, these verses have been a great difficulty for commentators, but it seems to indicate that wheels had 4 directional mobility. Leslie Allen notes the possibility of a globe-like structure where there are 2 wheels at right angles. Either way, it seems clear the throne chariot not only flies through the sky via winged cherubim, but also drives along the ground by means of 4 directional wheels. I think it's very appropriate to think of Isaiah 66:1. "Heaven is my throne, and the earth is my footstool." The text makes it clear that it is all connected. The heavens and the earth are connected. And the next few verses make this even more clear. For example, in verse 18, the text shifts back to the heavens. It states, "And their rims were tall and awesome, and the rims of all 4 were full of eyes all around." We have already mentioned the meaning of eyes, and the text shows that the wheels and the rims in the heavens refer to the constellations. It should also be noted that wheels are also symbolic of what? The passage of time. And if you remember in Genesis with the sun, moon, and stars, it tells us they're created for days and seasons, right? For the passage of time. Now, when you look at a picture of the zodiac, it looks like a big circle or a wheel. But it also represents what? A divine clock in the sky. The remainder of verses 19 through 21 clearly shows the connection between heaven and earth. The throne chariot connects them together in perfect harmony. Now, I want to mention something here. There are some authors out there that use this text as a way of showing a hierarchy of angels. Obviously, there is a hierarchy, and angels around God's throne, such as cherubim or seraphim, would be at the highest level of authority. It would also be assumed that angels on earth would be possibly of a lower rank or order. Now, it is possible that the text of Ezekiel is alluding to a hierarchy, but I really don't think the text is clear enough for us to say that for sure, except what it says about the cherubim. Now, before moving on to the next set of verses, 22 through 27, which talks about the platform and the throne, I want to go back for just a minute. Because the text is so difficult to interpret, it's easy to get lost in the details. The vision is really showing 2 aspects of God. First, that Yahweh is coming in a storm or judgment, and that he is king of the universe, enthroned in glory and majesty. And I would add to this, based on other interpretations of this chapter, Ezekiel is not describing a spaceship, okay? He is not describing a spaceship, not a UFO, or a small little God on a pedestal. The prophet is seeing a huge God in heaven, enthroned on a chariot that is magnificent and above all is big. God is big. Yahweh is maintaining all authority and power from on high. He is bigger, greater, and more glorious than even the stars of the heavens. Now that makes a great segue to the next set of verses. Starting in verse 22, this is what it says. Over the heads of the living creatures there was the likeness of an expanse, shining like awe-inspiring crystal. Spread out above their heads, and under the expanse their wings were stretched out straight, one toward another. And each creature had 2 wings covering its body, and when they went, I heard the sound of their wings like the sound of many waters, like the sound of the Almighty, and the sound of tumult like the sound of an army. And when they stood, they let down their wings. And there came a voice from above the expanse over their heads, and when they stood still, they let down their wings. And above the expanse over their heads there was the likeness of a throne, in appearance like sapphire. And seated above the likeness of a throne was the likeness of a human appearance. And above them, what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were gleaming metal, like the appearance of fire enclosed all around. And downward from what had the appearance of his waist, I saw as it were the appearance of fire. And there was brightness around him. And that's all the way to verse 27. So next we have this expanse or firmament above the heads of the cherubim. We could consider it like a platform on which God's throne rests. In Revelation 4, it describes this expanse as a sea of glass, like crystal. I believe this is like a one-way window where God sees everything clearly from his throne through this sea of glass, but we cannot see into heaven past this expanse. The scene reminds us of the firmament of the sky mentioned in Genesis 1, 6-8. We're also reminded of the heavenly beings of God's government serving as sky bearers. What is interesting is the cherubim create noise by the movement of their wings. The text tells us the noise was like the voice of the Almighty. It was like an army. Then there is a voice from above the expanse. What is the text telling us in Ezekiel? That Yahweh is about to speak in a thunderous voice like a storm, like an army. God is about to speak in judgment to the nation, and he is getting Ezekiel prepared for his task to speak and act as his representative. It is most interesting that Ezekiel heard God before he sees him. And right after this thunderous noise and the voice of God, in verse 26, Ezekiel sees the throne, which is like a sapphire stone, and there is the appearance of a man on the throne. The prophet describes the brightness and the glory of God on his throne. Make no mistake, it is no accident throughout this vision of Ezekiel. We repeatedly see human features. Mark this, there is a man on the throne. This prefigures the coming of Jesus Christ and his ascension to the throne. Now for Ezekiel, he is being prepared to listen to the voice of God and speak as his representative to a very rebellious nation. And I think that any of us who dare to speak for God should continually put this text in front of us and remember who we represent. God is awesome in power and glory. His authority has no equal, and our response to him should be the same as Ezekiel, to fall down on our face before a mighty God. So as I reflect on the inaugural vision of Ezekiel, I'm reminded of the reality of who God is. We live in a dark and rebellious time. We should repent and return to God and remember who we're dealing with. Ezekiel 1 reminds us who God is and who is in charge. Now, I'm going to close with a story from history as a reminder, while kings may think they run the universe, they do not. Only Yahweh is in charge, and he is coming in a storm to met out the consequences of corrupt and rebellious leaders. In the 1600s, England experienced something called the Exclusion Crisis, which was a constitutional crisis between King Charles II and Parliament that almost brought the country to another civil war. Charles had no legitimate heir, which meant his brother James would inherit the throne. This struck fear and dread in the hearts of Protestants because James was a Catholic and they remembered the persecution of Mary Tudor. Members of Parliament, or MPs, were determined to exclude James from the throne through parliamentary acts. So, Charles dissolved the Parliament repeatedly to keep the exclusion bill from being passed. However, Anthony Ashley Cooper, who was Earl of Shaftesbury, a Protestant, had a majority in the Parliament from 1679 to 81. Now, Shaftesbury's party was nicknamed the Whigs, and they were opposed to Roman Catholicism and royal tyranny. The Whigs also formed an alliance with the nonconformists. As the Whigs tried to push the exclusion bill through Parliament, they were opposed by the Tories, who did not want Parliament interfering with the royal line of succession. The exclusion bill was passed, but the king did not accept it. The king dissolved Parliament for a third time, but this time he called a new Parliament back to Oxford instead of London, and he employed royal troops to help him. When the king rejected the bill again and dissolved the Parliament, the MPs were on the losing end. Shaftesbury was arrested and charged with treason. There was a plot, the Rye House plot of 1683, to assassinate Charles, but it failed, and several leading Whigs were arrested and executed. Charles essentially made himself an absolute monarch, but his reign of terror had consequences. The Whigs were stripped of power, and the cities and towns lost their right to elect magistrates without the king's consent. And Charles severely persecuted the nonconformists. In the end, James, Duke of York, did claim the throne of England. But at what cost? Political leaders often act like royalty and refuse to bend and work within the rule of law. However, there are consequences. After James II came to the throne in 1685, it seemed that all would be okay as the king tried to smooth things over and not criticize the Church of England. However, even though James promised not to re-Catholicize England, within 3 years the Tories and the Whigs joined together to remove James from the throne. When we do not follow God's ways and do what is right, there are consequences. Today we have political kings who act like royalty, always trying to force their way, no matter what the Constitution or law states. There are consequences. The time of Ezekiel was very similar. It was a time of great rebellion against God. And God's singular message to his prophet and the nation was that he was about to speak like thunder.